Dude, what's the matter? What happened? What's going on? There's so much!
Sonic the Hedgehog 1991. After its release on June 23rd, 1991, the original Sonic the Hedgehog on Sega Genesis made an incredible impact on the video game industry, selling millions of units, putting Sega on the map, and inspiring a generation of fans and game developers to pursue their dreams, all through this one single game. Oh, sorry, I mean the 16 very similar games. Because of Sonic 1's massive success, Sega found it appropriate to re-release the game on newer hardware as the Sega Genesis became outdated. The only problem with that is that they never learned when to stop. There are a seemingly endless amount of versions of Sonic 1. That is, if you count somewhere around 20 as an endless amount. So this all begs the question, what is the best version of Sonic 1? What's the worst? What's the version I play if I'm feeling like crap after a walk on the town? Well, that's what I plan on answering today. I'm ranking numerous versions of Sonic the Hedgehog 1 to see which one reigns supreme as the best way to play an old game from 1991. Now, just to clarify, I won't be talking about the 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog, or the Master System version of Sonic the Hedgehog, or the 2006 version of Sonic the Hedgehog. Okay, well, yeah, we will be talking about that one. No, we're talking about the original 1991 game that started it all. The one that wouldn't have been made if it weren't for the Gulf War. Now, despite what you may be believing, I won't be ranking all the Sonic 1 re-releases, since some of them are far too similar to the original for me to rank. However, I will be ranking every single official version of the game with noticeable differences. Official is the key word there, so fan-made ports are out of the running. I don't want to see you saying, oh, but Sonic 1 Forever is the best version of the game. Well, yeah, you're right, it is, but it's not the official version, so it doesn't count. The best version is Sonic Jam on the game. No, Sonic 1 wasn't on the game call. Without further ado, let's get started with a good version of Sonic 1. Yeah, like I said, there are a few versions of Sonic 1 that are nearly identical to the original version with very few or small differences. But these are just enough to where I can actually say small things about them, so I'll just give them honorable mentions. Starting with the Sonic Mega Collection version, the only difference here that I can really notice is that it uses the Japanese version of Sonic 1 that was released after the well-known American release and came with a few bug fixes and has messed up sound when spinning the goalpost. Other than that, it's basically identical. The same goes with the Wii Virtual Console re-release, the Sonic Ultimate Genesis Collection, the PSP Genesis Collection. Really, almost any Sega Genesis collection serves this game well. But then the question might be asked, what doesn't serve this game well? Number 16.
Prepare to feel my unbridled wrath.
What do you want me to say? It's Sonic Genesis. It's iconic. It's infamous. Everybody knows about how poor this port is. Some Call Me Johnny, like what was it, 15 years ago, was possessed by a Sonic cat and ranted about this game, and it got like 100,000 views. I talked about this game over a year ago! Sonic Genesis was released extremely late into the Game Boy Advance's life cycle in 2006, and crashed so hard that it went straight through everyone's heads and was never forgotten. Sonic Genesis was developed by Dimps, the creators of the Sonic Advance games for the Game Boy Advance, which were stellar tributes to the original 2D Sonic games. If anyone was to remake the original games on the GBA, it would definitely be them. Unfortunately, Sonic Genesis is by far their worst outing. It's got butchered music due to the GBA sound quality, an incredibly zoomed-in screen, choppy movement that makes Sonic incredibly frustrating to control, awkward physics, abysmal slowdown, you name it, Sonic Genesis probably has it. Okay, you got me there, but I don't understand how this ended up the way it did. The Game Boy Advance was more than capable of handling games like this. It was more powerful than the Sega Genesis, being a 32-bit console instead of a 16-bit one. It could run tons of Super Nintendo games like Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, Yoshi's Island. There is no excuse as to why this was released the way it was. There are fan-made versions of Sonic 1 made specifically for the GBA, and the game runs nearly flawless, albeit with a zoomed-in screen. It gives Sonic Genesis absolutely no reason to be the way it is, but hey, it's not all bad though. The Anniversary mode lets you use the spin dash in Sonic 1 for the first time on a handheld! The gas station from the last time I tried this is still on fire. I sure hope number 15 isn't the Java version of Sonic 1.
Could I get the number 15?
Dang it. Okay, so this one is a little funky. Since there are multiple versions of this, depending on the processing power of the phone you're using, certain ones remove zones, remove backgrounds, and all of them are split into two parts. So if I really wanted to, I could say that number 16 is Sonic Part 2 because it has only 1.5 fun stages, and number 15 is Sonic Part 1 because it has 3 fun stages. but I made this ranking before I remembered this port is split into two, so we'll just count them as one. Sonic 1 Java, on more powerful phones at least, is basically if Sonic 1 was downported to Flash and had really crunched Sonic sprites. All the sound effects are gone, and all that remains are MIDI renditions of the game's soundtrack. And that's pretty much all it is. It plays a little worse since you can't port the physics over exactly, but that's it. It's Sonic 1 on an old flip phone. The one of many until Sonic Runner's Adventure in 2017. A Sonic Java game in 2017, what? Sonic 1 for the iPod is a weird one. I have no idea if this is emulated or not, but it seems to be extremely faithful to the original game, just with an extra tutorial, some loading screens, and an autosave feature. The performance of the game itself seems to be overall decent, so then what prevents this from being any higher? We're playing this on an iPod. The iPod had this click wheel that you would swipe to move around in menus. I remember this being really finicky when I was younger, when all I wanted to do on my iPod was watch Thomas the Train or listen to Supersonic Racing. You can tap the wheel to move and click it to jump. It's kind of like how you control the Sonic 1 remake on Apple TV, which is also extremely finicky. Oh yeah, sorry, spoilers, the Sonic 1 remake is on the list at some point. But hey, this is one of the first instances of a handheld version of Sonic 1 that doesn't completely suck. I'm not talking about you today, but you're still pretty good.
This is what the soundtrack from this level is supposed to sound like.
Here we are, the AtGames Sega Genesis. You've all been waiting for this, is what I would say if this is the console you're thinking of. The AtGames Sega Genesis consoles are notorious for their poor emulation of the games they run, and Sonic 1 is no exception. They're known for their poor picture quality, strange controls, and most of all, their horrendous audio quality. But the version of Sonic 1 AtGames published that landed on this part of the list is not that version. No, this is the AtGames Sega Genesis flashback console. It claimed to have been a massive improvement over the previous consoles, housing better audio quality. The flashback was released in two different models, the one that released initially and the one that was released about a year later that seemed to have fixed many issues the original had. I do not own the fixed version. The flashback version of Sonic 1 I took a look at was the initially released version, and in my opinion, this is the worst AtGames has done Sonic 1. While the audio quality for nearly every game is better, for AtGames standards, most of the Sonic games, including Sonic 1, are extremely choppy. The game's frame rate is cut in half, going from 60 frames per second to 30. I could be wrong since I haven't owned a previous AtGames console in years, but I'm pretty sure those versions ran at the full frame rate, albeit with a myriad of other issues. The console runs on some crappy version of Android and literally is not even a quarter size of the shell, so I guess it makes sense why the games run as crap as they do. Regardless, this is unacceptable. The half frame rate makes this game feel far more sluggish to play. It also breaks a few visual elements, like the shields. Just from that alone, that makes this version of Sonic 1 the worst that AtGames has ever published. Which begs the question, what about the other version that AtGames made surpassed this version somehow? Good question. Let's talk about Sonic Classic Collection instead.
Nintendo DS. Touching is good.
That's right. Nintendo comes back swinging after dragging us through the mud with Sonic Genesis. Now they're just dragging us through a really weird smelling O'Charlie's with Sonic Classic Collection. Classic Collection is a compilation of all three Genesis Sonic games for the DS and is actually pretty well done for the console. It's got its quirks, but by and large, these are definitely ways that you can play the classic Sonic trilogy, that's for sure. The only problem though is that these games are weirdly scaled, causing distorted sprites, the camera sometimes having a tough time keeping up with Sonic, or it overcorrects, causing it to feel really awkward, and the game still has a bit more slowdown than I'd like. All that said, Sonic Classic Collection's version of Sonic 1 is fine. There are tons of better ways to play the game, but this is bearable. You know, now I'm starting to question why I put the original AtGames version over this one.
She's holding a f***ing
Here we are, the AtGames Sega Genesis. You've all been waiting for this! Including my old youth pastor, because I'm sure he remembers the one time I talked about this version of the game's reputation after he bought one of the consoles. You'd think Pharaoh would have still enslaved the Israelites if he knew he was going to drown in the Red Sea, and AtGames would eventually release this thousands of years later. The AtGames Sega Genesis version of Sonic 1 is honestly not the worst in the world. Is it bad? Oh yeah, it's bad. The picture quality is extremely fuzzy, especially for a device that was being sold to people in the year 2015, and the audio quality speaks for itself. Not to mention, most versions of this console have this really weird controller that only accepts inputs when directly aimed at the console like a TV remote. So you might get instances where your inputs can't be detected by the game, or your input takes longer than expected to be received. All that said though, these versions do indeed run at a higher frame rate than the flashback version, so genuinely that is literally the only reason this version is as high as it is. It's still terrible, don't get it twisted, but the fact that I can play this version perfectly just by muting the TV and pretending that I live in 1999 is quite telling about how much better it is. Well, actually I lied. In 1999 you'd have something slightly more tolerable than this. Whoa, finally! A version of Sonic 1 running on official Sega hardware! And unfortunately, it has problems immediately. While the picture quality is far better than the AtGames version, the audio quality is just as scuffed. Now, it isn't extremely low-pitched and weird or anything like the AtGames console, but the instruments and sound effects themselves sound bit crunched. In my opinion, I actually kinda like it in a bubble. Outside of the few hiccups, the sounds are pretty nice, and the tracks are pretty cool renditions of the songs. But I don't think that's what Sega was going for. It's very obvious that this is a fault of poor emulation, especially with the hiccups found in the audio. On top of that, there's tons of slowdown. Nothing egregious like Sonic Genesis, but the frame rate will come to a halt in the most arbitrary of places. There's also this really weird bug in Labyrinth Zone where the entire stage has its underwater palette, making both the surface and the water look like Sonic is submerged in the water. The Sega Smash Pack version of Sonic 1 is fine for what it is. It passes under the idea that it's better than anything AtGames has put out.
The most advanced iPhones we've ever made.
Whoa, you put Sonic 1 on the iPhone this low? But it's one of the best versions of the game!
Said all the 10-year-olds and other people who weren't aware there was a version of Sonic 1 on iPhone before the Christian Whitehead port in the crowd. This version of Sonic 1 is essentially a Sega Genesis ROM slapped onto the iPhone with some touch controls in it. Not much more than that. From here on, the versions of Sonic 1 on this list are actually decent ways to play the game, and the original iPhone version seems to be no exception. I say it seems because looking at old footage, the game looks extremely choppy on some, and quite smooth on others. I can only assume that depends on the iPhone you had at the time. I never actually owned this version. However, I did have the version of Sonic Spinball that was released alongside the version of Sonic 1. It was fine. I feel like there isn't really much more to say here. This version is just fine. When Sonic 1 was new, it was not only playable on the Sega Genesis, but also in arcades under the Sega Mega Play line, and depending on who you ask, this might be even better than the main version of the game. In the Mega Play version, you go through the same levels with the same controls, but now you're at the mercy of a ticking clock forcing you to think quickly while also trying to destroy as many enemies and collecting as many rings as possible to increase your score. On top of that, when you finish Green Hill Zone, you'll learn that certain stages have been completely removed. Marble and Labyrinth Zone are absent to keep the speedy pace going for an arcade setting, where there might be people waiting in line to get a turn. And since these stages are very much disliked by a large number of players, some people may consider this version of the game superior to the main Sega Genesis version. Isn't that right, Luke?
What? No, are you out of your mind?
No, I just have schizophrenia.
Ah, right. Yeah.
Who said that?
The Mega Play version of Sonic 1 can be great depending on what you like out of Sonic 1, but in my opinion, while I appreciate the change of pace, I'd rather get the entire Sonic 1 experience. But this is still accurate enough to be considered almost, if not just as good as the original.
Who wants a brand new Xbox?
In the original Xbox 360 version of Sonic Generations, not only was Sonic voiced by Patrick Warburton before being removed from the PC version, but there was also an unlockable version of Sonic 1. This version is nearly identical to the original, but now you can't access the level select or debug mode. So it's worse because of it. And we've made it. The original version of Sonic the Hedgehog. Whether it be on original hardware, emulated, or in some basic collection, you can't really go wrong here. It's the way the game was initially intended to be played. Any issues here are mainly the fault of the Sega Genesis, whether it be bits of slowdown, the music losing certain instruments when lots of sound effects are playing, or any other hardware limitation. This game is overall still fantastic, and such a landmark title on the video game industry. Now that we've reached the original version of the game, every version beyond this point is a substantial improvement from the original version of the game, whether it be a massive change that completely overhauls how the game functions, or Sonic popping out at you.
Picture my booty up in 3D.
This is weird. 3D Sonic the Hedgehog is part of the Sega 3D Classics line for the Nintendo 3DS, a series of games that add 3D effects and quality of life improvements to classic Sega Genesis games, which include Sonic 1. 3D Sonic features two versions of the 3D effect. Pop-in or in-depth. The former has all the elements pop out at you, making everything feel much more in your face, like if I threw this grenade at my neighbor and aimed it for his face. And the latter has a background element sink deeper into the background, giving the visuals far more depth. As for the quality of life improvements, we're given the ability to choose between the American and Japanese versions of the game, which have subtle differences, and toggle to use the spin dash from later classic games. And that basically makes it automatically superior to the original game. Having the option for newer moves, a toggle between versions, and features like the 3D visuals are just enough to give it a slight edge over the original. But the developers of 3D Sonic weren't done yet, because a few years later, they'd release a version that would go even further beyond for the Nintendo Switch.
Send in everyone.
M2, the developers of Sega 3D Classics, has proved that their quality with remastering Sega titles is top of the line, and they went even further beyond with their Sega Ages series, beginning with Sonic 1. This version is packed with features on top of the base game. The spin dash is back, along with customizable controls for a single button game. The drop dash from Sonic Mania, a time attack mode, leaderboards, and a faithful recreation of the Mega Play version of Sonic 1, all with the countdown and stages removed. The general quality with this re-release is through the roof. The user interface is sharp, clean, and stunningly beautiful. You have so many selections for visual modes, whether you want to play with the CRT filters, a smaller pixel perfect resolution, or stretched out like a weirdo. And there are multiple versions of the game available on the fly. You can switch between the Genesis version, Mega Drive version, or Mega Play version with one switch, even allowing you to have an easy mode where you hold a certain amount of rings at the beginning of the stage. There is so much personalization in this release, and I'm sure some would argue that this, by far, is the best version of Sonic 1, and honestly, I'd completely understand their perspective. However, for me, there are a few more versions that far surpass Sega Ages for me.
Miss Frizzle could be on Saturn, couldn't she?
The first Sonic 1 re-release, and it's this high up? Sonic peaked in high school, just like us. Sonic Jam is a compilation unlike anything else I've seen from a re-release. I won't go too in-depth on Jam as a whole since I discussed it in its entirety nearly 4 years ago, but it takes the original Sonic Genesis games and properly ports them to the Sega Saturn. That's right, this isn't an emulation. These games are running natively on Sega Saturn hardware, which gives way for many quality of life improvements for the games, including Sonic 1. The game is given CD quality sound effects, which doesn't seem that crazy, but certain sounds and jingles are given much more life through remastered audio. Most of the slowdown from the original game is gone, and since the music and sound effects don't share channels, the sound effects don't cancel out the music playing. The spin dash is available as an option in the menus, and it works just as well as it does in Sonic 2 and Sonic 3. Speaking of those options, you're also given the choice between different difficulties: normal mode, easy mode, and original mode. Original is basically the same as the original Genesis game. Normal mode is very similar to the original, but it makes slight balance and level design changes. And easy mode makes the stages even easier and only has one act per zone. Show a speedrunner of the original game your Sonic 1 time and go, "Oh man, I got 10 minutes on Sonic 1! What did you get?" Oh. And since this is a compilation of the entire Sonic Genesis trilogy, you can lock Sonic 1 onto Sonic & Knuckles and access Blue Sphere. It may not be part of the actual Sonic 1, but that's okay. It gives me an excuse to mention Sonic World. There, I mentioned it. Sonic Jam is a top-tier compilation with a top-tier version of Sonic 1 to go along with it. For the longest time, this was considered one of, if not the best version of Sonic 1. It ran natively on the console it was released on, it included the spin dash, and it had numerous quality of life improvements. But then, in 2013, a version of Sonic 1 would release with all of those features, and even more. No, it doesn't pour milk for you. Do something already! This is one of the best things to ever happen to the Sonic series. After being commissioned by Sega to remake Sonic CD, Christian Whitehead would go on to remake Sonic 1 for mobile phones. That's right, remake. This isn't an emulated version like the old mobile versions. This isn't a direct port like Sonic Jam. No. This is a from the ground up remake of Sonic 1. Every bit of stage design, physics, and music was remastered for the modern age. Sprites were polished up, music was re-recorded, and animations were smoothed out. Not to mention, it all comes with the leaderboard system, the spin dash once again, and new playable characters. For the first time ever, you can play as Tails or Knuckles in Sonic 1 with their own unique level design too. And it was through these remakes that we were able to get Sonic Mania, a wholly unique 2D classic Sonic game for the first time in 20 years. trailers that showed people in the 2010s that Sonic games could in fact be good, and brought the animation team headed by Tyson Hesse into the spotlight, which would likely be a factor that pushed Paramount to bring him onto the Sonic 2020 Trilogy's design team and fix the design for Sonic in the films, bringing faith back into the Sonic franchise as a whole. The only thing that kept so many people from trying this version was that it wasn't available on more hardware. For nearly 10 years, this remake would be stuck on phones and Apple TV. However, that wasn't until 2022, where, with a few extra features and enhancements, the best version of Sonic 1 would be released.
Origins!
Sonic Origins is the home of the best version of Sonic 1. Full stop. I get it, Sonic Origins had a bunch of bugs at launch that were already present in the Christian Whitehead version, but hey, those bugs still exist, but nobody talks about them because they didn't even debut in Sonic Origins in the first place. The Origins version of Sonic 1 is a port of the Christian Whitehead version, now on consoles and PC. So immediately, with no enhancements, this is the best version of Sonic 1, but even so, that's not it. Not only did this come with every feature the Whitehead version introduced, but it also comes with the drop dash from Sonic Mania, which does look a bit scuffed, I will admit, but it works really well. Amy Rose has a new playable character, infinite lives, the ability to play in 4x3 with lives restored, a boss rush mode, the ability to save your progress from a checkpoint, allowing you to resume from said checkpoint upon restarting the game, and various missions that take certain stages and remix them to push you to reach a specific goal. They essentially took the best version of Sonic 1, put it on devices that people actually wanted to play it on, gave it numerous features, combined it with 4 other classic Sonic titles, and turned it into the best way to play Sonic 1, and I'd argue the best way to play all the classic Sonic games. Now give us the worst by re-releasing Sonic Genesis. And that's every notable version of Sonic 1 ranked from worst to best. This was so much fun to do. Sonic 1 is such a special game to me and so many other gamers and Sonic fans out there. It pioneered the Sonic series into becoming what it is today. It created such a stir in the gaming industry to make it what it is today, and brought forth one of the most iconic characters in pop culture of all time. So knowing that the best version of the game is a version that the next generation will be able to experience for years to come, it's a feeling that not many gaming franchises will be able to experience. Which is why I'd like to pitch a concept for a remaster that will change gaming as we know it. Cars 2, the video game, re-weaponized. Remaster Cars 2, the video game with 60 FPS and online support. That's literally all you need. The game is already visually beautiful, the controls are already extremely smooth, the soundtrack is flawless. All you need is just a way for more people to experience it by porting it to modern consoles and giving it modern enhancements. Screw Cars 3, that game sucks! Cars 2 is great. And so is Cars 2. And Cars 2. And, wait for it, Sonic the Hedgehog for the Dig. Wait, does that count as a version of Sonic 1?